right away with a different schedule, 2 weeks on, 2 weeks off for people that work on our frac crews. No one else does that. It's typically 2 weeks on, 1 week off. But if you want to get great humans, dedicate their life and careers to working in your company, you got to make it the best damn place to work. So our goal was to make a differential frac company, different to be inside of our company, different to be our customer, different to be our partners and our suppliers. And we've absolutely loved doing it. Real quick, so our dominant source is hydraulic fracturing. We're in all of the major shale basins in North America. We're not in the Marcellus Utica with frac yet. We do have wireline operations there. We frac somewhere between 15% and 18% of all the wells drilled in the United States and Canada. So this little company we started 12 years ago has grown. And I showed there on a revenue basis our size of our company relative to the other North American North American oilfield service companies. We are today fourth, $4.9 billion in trailing 12-month revenues. We were third not long ago, but we've shown this pro forma with the Patterson-Nextier merger that moves them above Liberty in revenues. So though we're newer and maybe not known by a lot of people, fourth largest North American service company by revenue. And we didn't start the company to be big. Big has never been a goal of the company. We had sort of a passionate, I would say an ambitious agenda to build the best damn frac company, period. So our goal was to be better, was to be differential. Big has just been an output, not a design criterion. It's just been an output of doing things reasonably well. And I showed that on the bottom. So on the bottom, that's the same top 10 energy service companies in North America. So look, Weatherford and ChampionX and National Oilwell Varco, these are more household names, but now smaller companies than Liberty. But on the bottom bar graph is the return on capital employed over the last 12 months of all of those companies. I get paid based on return on capital. I've been a lifetime entrepreneur. To make a successful business, you've got to gather capital. It might just be your own or your own and your other friends' capital. And if you deliver a strong return on that capital, you can reinvest, you can grow a business, you can provide something differential. If you don't provide high returns on capital, you're either going to go out of business or you're going to have a mediocre company. So you can see Liberty there about 2x the second company in return on capital employed in the last 12 months, and more than 3 times the average of those 10 larger companies. Now you say I cherry pick. People are going to say that about my climate change data, but like my business data, they are complete data sets. That's the last year, but let's look at, did we just have a great year? This says no. This is the entire history of our company. 12 years of generating revenue. That's our cash return on capital invested for every one of those years. So if you look across that, I'll talk about the averages first. Our average on return on capital employed has been 23% over the history of our company, about 50% higher than the S&P 500, and 2.5 times higher than our industry. This has not been a great decade for our industry, as everyone in this room knows. So if we've had 50% higher return on capital employed than the S&P 500, surely that's reflected in our valuation, but maybe not. Our trailing 12 months price to earnings ratio right now is 5. The S&P 500 trailing 12 months price to earning ratio is 23. So that says people don't like our industry, or they don't believe in our industry. I think that's going to change in the next few years because we make the world go round, and we have for the last century, and we almost certainly will for the rest of this century as well. But that is not a widespread belief today. The other thing you see out of that plot is this huge variability. Yes, is our industry cyclical? Yes. If you build an asset that lasts a long time, you get a cyclical industry. I believe, and only time will tell, we may have a little bit less cyclicality in the next decade than we've had in the last decade. But those 2 downturns that happened, the 2 worst downturns I've seen in my career, have been in the last decade. That 15-16 downturn, in the depths of that, when there were no other buyers, we bought Sandgel, a Canadian frac company, a good company that had a bad balance sheet that got bit in a bad downturn. And in that depth in 2016, there were no other buyers, and we bought a company well larger than us, all for cash. With almost all their people gone, we took over some core people, we refurbed their assets, and we were able to ride the rebound as the industry came out of that downturn. We certainly didn't foresee another downturn coming, but when the COVID downturn hit, having a strong balance sheet, having strong demand from our customers, we executed another transaction. We bought Schlumberger's frac, cased hole wireline, and sand mining businesses. So we bought a business well bigger than us. This time in all equity, we gave over a little more than a third of the equity in our company to close that transaction. But if you have a strong balance sheet and you're in a good position, you can take advantage. I love the volatility of our industry. I think it brings opportunity, and it brings a greater range of differential performance of companies. To me, your most important thing in business is to have a competitive advantage. Have a competitive advantage. And there's a few points there or whatever, like what are our priorities? Disciplined growth. When times are good, and times are crazy good, that's usually the worst time to grow. The best time to grow is when things are tough and no one else wants to do anything. So disciplined growth, high returns, I mentioned that if you have a high return on the capital you've got invested, you can fund all of your own growth. You don't have to depend on the outside marketplaces. Balance sheet strength, you got to be ready for what's coming. Innovation, I'm a lifelong tech nerd, and a lot of our company is really competitive tech nerds. We believe in technology, humans, and culture. Those things together drive improvement and can drive the strength of your businesses. Real quick, so the well site where things happen, right? It used to be in the old days, the most important thing at a well site was drilling. That was the centerpiece of building wells. Drilling's still very important today, but completions in frac is by far the biggest piece of well construction from a capital expenditures, from a humans, from a technology perspective. That's the business Liberty is in. I'll talk more about our frac fleets in a second, but there's 50,000 beautiful horsepower on location. There's also a wireline crew that's got to go down and shoot holes in the pipe and put plugs to isolate between the different stages. Liberty also does that plug and perf wireline surface. What's the biggest external input to hydraulic fracturing? Sand. We pump nearly 1 billion pounds of sand underground every week. Every week. Think of moving all of that sand. In the Permian Basin, we operate 2 of the biggest and best mines in the basin that come straight out of Liberty mine fleets. We also own a company, we actually launched it 8 years ago, called Propane Express. It's a logistics company for moving sand. And importantly, it has a new technology to move wet sand, damp sand, cheaper sand, locally mined sand. So part of Liberty's role in the well site is to deliver the sand logistics as well. Our new frac fleets all burn natural gas. And why do we burn natural gas? Because delivered to the well site into the frac fleets, it's roughly half the price of diesel. That's a huge cost saving. That's $10 to $20 million a year savings per frac fleet. So we are working with our customers. Of course, it's also cleaner burning. There's less pollutants from burning natural gas than burning diesel, and there's less greenhouse gas emissions. So we have a Liberty Power Innovations business that delivers this gas to our frac fleets on location and to customer drill rigs or other operating sites. This is a new business. We're super excited about it. It's either bringing compressed natural gas from nearby pipelines where we've got compressor stations, or it's taking field gas on location and then processing it and treating it to knock the liquids out and get a quality of gas we can burn to run frac operations. Our next generation frac fleets I'll talk about in a second. We're also moving, we've always been the designer of these fleets, and we're moving to actually design and manufacture the core components of our next generation fleets. So we're sort of broadening the things we're involved in all around this central process of making the shale revolution happen through hydraulic fracturing. Digifract on the top left. This is an all-electric frac pump. We didn't just take what used to be a diesel engine and buy a big-ass electric motor on it. We designed it from the bottom up. If you're starting from a blank sheet, how would you design an electric frac pump? It is very different than the other operations out there. It has been a 5-year effort. If you want to do something right for the long term, that takes time and that takes investment. When we started it, we didn't know if it'd be a 3-year effort or a 5-year effort or a 7-year effort, but we've always played the long game. Digifract, super exciting. It's in the field today, super strong start, but early on. DG Prime is sort of the same idea of these gas reciprocating engines. If you take a turbine and make it small, you lose the advantages of a turbine. You lose the thermal efficiency, you lose the ability to combust methane at a high percent, you seep methane into the atmosphere. It's just not the right application when you shrink it down. Recip engines is the right technology answer for these. And we have a partnership with Rolls-Royce that have delivered these highest thermal efficiency engines, highest in the industry, both on our electric generation, down bottom left, highest thermal efficiency, and DigiPrime. DigiPrime takes most of the power out of that gas recip engine and sends it directly to a pump. So sort of direct drive with the recip engine, but it's a hybrid. It also it can take some of that power and generate electricity to power everything else on location. When it needs a little boost of excess power, it can take all of the recip power into the engine and draw on the little mini electrical grid it's got from electric storage and use that. So this will probably be the workhorse, the backbone of the Liberty fleet in the coming decade. We have an electric wire line we call DigiWire to go with that. And that's all I'll say on this. So on location, you're going to custom design your fleet. If you've got a fair amount of grid power, we can use that grid power. It's hard to run frac operations off the grid because you need 25 megawatts and then you shut in between stages or something went wrong and you shut in and you don't need 25 megawatts and then you need 25 megawatts. So most of that power today is generated on location. It probably will be for some time. But to the extent we can use more and more grid power in our frac operations, fantastic. So these are sort of custom configurable operations. Of course, we've got artificial intelligence and all sorts of smarts on location that are monitoring thousands of data points continuously on operations when a pump might need some love, when it needs a change of part, when it needs a servicing. So we're trying to use technology and humans to figure out how to run operations safer, faster, more efficient. Ending on Liberty, a summary. I mentioned high returns since the day we started the company. We are today 4th largest company. Kimberlite does a survey every year. They basically call all the customers that use hydraulic fracturing service. They probably call a ton of people that are in this room. Every year we've been in the survey, Liberty has been #1 ranked for service quality. As he said, we have a better work schedule, 2 weeks on. Does that cost us more money? It does. To deliver something better, it costs us more money. But I think our track record has showed that investment in higher operating costs has been more than worth it in delivering superior quality services. Just last 12 months, $1.2 billion in adjusted EBITDA over the last 12 months, $616 million post-tax net income, $3.36 a share. We are a taxpayer, unusual in our space. Sorry, so my jokes are funny and most of them are not. All right, I'm going to talk a little bit about just the bigger picture of energy. Energy is the agent of change. If you want to move something from A to B or melt something or change the form of anything, change the temperature of this room up or down, none of those things are possible without energy. Farming. This is how we used to farm. The only mechanical power you had in the world was human effort to draw a plow or horse or oxen until relatively recent times. The arrival of hydrocarbons have changed the game. Used to be far more than half of humanity throughout all of human history were farmers. They were gathering and producing food. Today, 1% of Americans feed our entire country, and we can see very well, and we're a giant food exporter. That's energy, and also energy-enabled technology. What about transportation? Same story there. 200 years ago, your way to go around, the speed you could travel the world was the same as it was during Roman times. No meaningful change in 2,000 years. Hydrocarbons arrived, and now these giant flowing ships fly people to Thailand for a weekend vacation. Go back a few generations and ask them what they think about that idea. Just unbelievable it's possible, and today it's commonplace. Maybe this one's even bigger. Think of healthcare. Global life expectancy was 30 years 200 years ago. It was roughly 30 years 20,000 years ago. About a quarter of all children born never got to their 5th birthday. That was the norm. Many of our early presidents lost countless children. They were the top of society, but that's just the way the world worked. Modern medicine has changed that dramatically. Global life expectancy today, 72 years. I vote for with hydrocarbons versus without hydrocarbons. Here's cooking. The difference in this slide is the picture on the left and the picture on the right are both today. This is not history versus today. This is on the left. That's about 1/3 of humanity. That's 2.5 billion people. And on the right, that's the other 5 billion or so people. Then there's gradations between those. But look at that picture on the left. 2.5 billion people today are hand grinding grain, hand building, sort of the building blocks of our meals, and then cooking it indoors, burning wood or dung or agricultural waste. 2.5 billion people do that today. They want this. They want a simple, clean burning stove. They turn off and they turn off. Everyone in this room, we're quite lucky to have it. Don't forget how lucky we are to have everything we have. So in our Bettering Human Lives report, our sustainability or whatever you want to call it, the new one will be out in about a month. But in our report, we address what we view as the 3 largest energy challenges today. Number 1, energy poverty. I'll elaborate on that in a second. That's that 2.5 billion people. The other 5.5 billion people, their quality of life, their opportunities in life depend on a secure supply of reliable, affordable, and as clean as possible energy. Everything involves trade-offs. And number 3, climate change. This is the one we hear the most about. But if you look at the math and you look at the numbers and the impacts on the environment and humans, climate change is a distant, distant third. But for policy and for noise and for mind share, it dominates the dialogue today. Hence, I think it's important that everyone in this room learn as much as you can about climate change. We don't know the future, but what historically has transpired and what's happened, we know all of that. Let's familiarize ourselves with that, and I'm going to do a little bit of that. Here's where the world gets energy, sort of the global, and this is the whole planet, so it's different in different countries. This is where the world gets energy over the last 220 years. As I said, over in the left side of that plot, we were 100% renewable, dominantly wood, and then we had a 30-year life expectancy, and if the rains or the sun was bad that year, we had awful years and a lot of people died, and some year we had abundant harvest, but we were at the whims of nature. And life was tough and life was grinding. Then coal came into the place. You can see coal only got equal to wood about the year 1900. So even the 1800s, the 19th century, really was the last century of wood. Then the 1900s, the 20th century, the first half of it really was the century of coal. And wood didn't shrink. We didn't displace wood. We added something on top of it. We added more energy and a better source of energy that we could transport more easier, that burned cleaner. People that are against coal, I'm like, compared to what? Compared to no energy, compared to burning wood? Coal's awesome. It's the #1 source of global electricity today for a reason. It's cheap, it's reliable, it's affordable. And it will be the #1 global source of electricity for a long time into the future. Oil arrived. Then natural gas arrived. And you can see, look, the energy system today is completely dominated by coal, oil, and natural gas. And currently, all of them are at record high consumption. None of them are shrinking. Their market share has shrunk a little bit. 30 years ago, when the energy transition movement started, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change was formed, hydrocarbons were 87% of global energy, and they plunged all the way to 82.5% in 30 years. So when people tell me we're in the midst of an energy transition, I'm like, where's the energy transition? And again, the honest answer is we're not. and pretending we are and spinning it this way or that way. It's not productive. Let's be honest. Look, I went to college to work on fusion energy. I then worked on solar energy. I then worked on geothermal energy. I'm not an oil and gas guy by background. I love new, better energy technologies. I'm all for them. The problem is we don't have one that has meaningful running in front of them. Nuclear, and to a lesser extent geothermal, they can play a growing role in the energy system, and I think they slowly will in the coming decades. And I'm all for it. In fact, we are invested in putting effort and money into those things. But we keep that in perspective for the scale and the speed at which they will happen. All the noises about wind and solar, and you can see wind and solar at the top up there somewhere. You got to squint, but there's two skinny little lines. They also should. So there are 3 to 4% of global energy today, but even that is a wild overstatement. They're not independent sources of energy. It takes way more hydrocarbons to build a wind farm or a solar farm than it takes to build an oil field or a natural gas field. Very energy, land, and material intensive to build that 3 or 4%. And then you get a very low quality energy because you don't know when it's going to be available and when it's not going to be available. Cloud comes over and it declines. You know, or the wind stops blowing, it changes. So even the supply of electricity is completely dependent upon a secondary, the main electricity grid, and mostly it's natural gas power that's going up and down to try to firm those sources. But given that material intensity, the land intensity, intermittency, like they're not going to be meaningful players in global energy in the next few decades. And there's not a new technology revolution going on. The bets limit about the maximum amount of kinetic energy you can harvest from wind turbines. There's not even 50% more upside in the perfect wind harnessing technology. The same is true with the Shockley limit on solar power. So they're going to get a little bit better, but there's not meaningful running room, and they all play in the electricity sector. That's 20% of global energy. That's the ceiling. Really, half of that is probably the economic extreme pain, destabilized grids, and expensive electricity. Maybe you get to there. So just my message to people about energy is be excited about new things, but be realistic about how the world runs and how it might run in the future. And you see it collapse, right? The EIA net zero 2050 thing assumes that total global energy demand drops meaningfully in the next 30 years. Do you see that big drop in that plot? Would that big drop be a good thing for people's lives? So real quick, jumping into these issues. Energy poverty. I haven't mentioned 5 billion people today, well more than half the planet, are walking around in hand-washed clothes. All of our ancestors, of course, everybody walked around in hand-washed clothes. If you go back and talk to your grandmother or your great-grandmother, the arrival of a washing machine is absolutely game-changing for a family. It's just massive amount of hours and time saved, and people's wardrobes get bigger. And it's just, we don't want to go back there. 5 billion people haven't even got there to their first machine-washed clothes. 800 million people have no access to electricity. About another billion get a few hours a day of low-wattage electricity. They can charge a cell phone or have some lights in the start of the nighttime, but they lose power all the time. They can't use those to increase their productivity and get wealthier. I mentioned this clean cooking fuels thing. This is the single biggest target. Our sustainability report's called the Bettering Human Lives report. We're launching the Bettering Human Lives Foundation, and we're going to partner with all of you and many others to help speed the access of clean cooking fuels to the 2.5 billion people that don't have them. Not only is it disempowering to women and girls who spend 1 to 5 hours per day walking around trying to gather fuel wood to keep warm and to cook meals. You provide a stove you can turn on and you can turn off. You also save 3 million lives a year die from indoor air pollution. Just that smoke and particulate matter from burning wood inside. That's roughly equal to the annual COVID death rate we had over the last 3 years. But we shut the planet down because that was wealthy people in wealthy countries that were the focus of the people that were dying. This is lower income, mostly women and children who are dying in countries. And apparently people care a lot less about that. That's just wrong. That's just wrong. We cannot get energy wrong. Optimism. What's going on with clean cooking fuels? So the biggest ingredient in this sort of gas stove is propane, right? It's a liquid petroleum gas. This is the top 8 exporters of liquid petroleum gas in the world. We used to be 8th. Today, the United States exports more liquid petroleum gas than the next 7 combined. We're flooding the world. Most of that propane is going into crackers and making petrochemicals, but it's massively more available and therefore keeping the price down for clean cooking fuels. There's many things the shale revolution I'm crazy proud of. This is the thing I'm proudest of all of. We've a little more than doubled our oil production, not quite doubled our natural gas production. We've more than tripled our propane production. This is awesome. Shout this from the rooftops when you're writing your reports about the good you're doing for the world. So what about the other 5.5 billion people? Okay, they've got a stove of some kind. It might be propane burning if you're in a rural area. You get methane if you're local, or you might have electric cooking. But you've got a stove you can turn on and off. You've got heating in your house. And in general, that's been this game changer. That's why we live longer. That's why we visit grandma even when she's 2,000 miles away. But not everyone enjoys those fruits. The price of energy matters. Expensive energy costs lives and shrinks opportunity. 10% of Americans have received a utility disconnection notice in the last 12 months. You're voting for, I want more wind and solar. They always say it's not going to increase electricity prices. Look at it. California's electricity price is 90% higher now. I used to berate that they were 50% higher than the rest of the country. If you invest in things that are intermittent and unreliable, and you need all the other stuff to firm them when they're not on, you are guaranteed to raise your price of electricity. Guaranteed. 10% of Americans can't pay their bills. 10% of Americans report that they can't afford to heat their homes to a safe temperature in the winter, and they can't afford to cool their homes to a safe temperature in the summer. The former, heating your homes to a safe temperature, is massively more important, but they both matter. So last winter, what happened? Europe, for the last 20 years, has declined their oil and natural gas. They're getting off oil and gas. They're going to put up solar panels and wind turbines and displace oil and gas. They don't displace oil and gas. So what they did was they ended up with a huge energy import. And of course, their biggest source of energy imports was Russia. And then Russia's even more bad than they were before. So the price of natural gas skyrocketed in Europe, the price of coal. In fact, the biggest, fastest growing source of home heating in Europe now is wood. People are installing wood-burning stoves. People are chopping down trees. At grocery stores, wood is now sold on the shelves, right? Because you've got to stay warm or you will die. So the public health data from the European Union last year, 65,000 people, 68,000, there's a wide skew on that. 68,000 more people died last winter in Europe than died the winter before in Europe, or than the winter before that. So it's not the amount of people that die from the cold in the winter. That's a huge number. It's just the excess amount of people that died because home heating prices were expensive in Europe. They said, oh, thank God Europe didn't really get a zinger from the whole Russia thing. Oh, yes, they did. An unseasonably warm winter still sent 68,000 people to premature deaths. In just a survey, 24% of Britons, 1 in 4 Britain, reported they weren't able to keep their homes to a safe temperature. And if you probably don't hear this in the news much either, but 8 times more people die from the cold than die from the heat. About 1% of global deaths are attributed to heat and to heat stress. 8% of global deaths are brought about by the cold. Even in Greece, 5 times more people die of the cold than die of the heat. In Africa, far more people die of the cold than die of the heat. When you make heating fuels, people can't use natural gas anymore, they're going to use electricity. You just double someone's heating costs. That is a massive burden and health risk you're putting on people. We should not do that without knowing what we're doing. I should have made this slide a little bit more animated. What's the fastest growing energy source on the planet by far? Natural gas. Oil's number two. Oil's number two. But natural gas has just grown tremendously fast. It's sort of it's growing both more market share and just providing wider and wider access. And look at all the things we use natural gas for. Number one, fertilizer, the Haber-Bosch process to synthesize nitrogen fertilizer. If we just said, and Sri Lanka did an experiment with this, we're not going to use hydrocarbons in our food system, we're going to be green. Within 6 months, the government fled the country, there were food riots, just a catastrophe in 6 months. If you just stopped using natural gas to produce nitrogen fertilizer, global food production would be cut in half. That's one use of natural gas. Manufacturing, the biggest use of energy, the most important use of energy is to make things, right? You can't have electricity or cars or planes or all that if you can't make those basic materials. We use as much energy globally to produce cement, steel, plastics, and fertilizer, just those four materials. Václav Smil, as I think rightfully called them, the four pillars of the modern world. We use as much energy to produce those four materials as the energy delivered on the entire electricity grid. 20% of world energy is to make those four pillars. 20% of world energy is delivered via electricity. So when you hear everyone talk about 20% of energy, electricity is one slice of energy. It's a nice slice. It's an important slice. It's 20% of global energy. What's the second biggest source of electricity production globally? Natural gas. Over 25% of global electricity. In the United States, it's 40%. Home heating and cooking. Half of US homes are heated by natural gas. That's a growing source of home heating around. Petrochemicals. Plastics, our iPhones, our clothes. All right, we'll end on climate change. And I'm going to give some brief summary stuff. This is nowhere near an exhaustive overview of climate change. I'm really just addressing the things we hear all the time. So a few points. What do we know about climate change? There's a few things that are not that controversial. One is climate is always changing, right? When oil and gas was created, say 100 million years ago in the time of the dinosaurs, the planet was massively warmer than it is today, 5 to 10 times higher CO2 concentration, and much more abundant life, right? 100-foot tall animals could walk around and find enough food. They would starve immediately today, right? So, and then these are long-term swings. 25,000 years ago, we were in the middle of a giant ice age. My house in Montana was under a mile of ice. And in fact, in another 25,000 years, it probably will be again. So climate has a huge natural changes as well. We came out of the little ice age in the 1850s, I'll show that. So the warming and sea level rise we're seeing today, and I think our burning of hydrocarbons and CO2 is absolutely a part of that, but the planet was already warming and sea levels were already rising before hydrocarbons changed anything. Hydrocarbons but climate change is real, and our products, oil, gas, and coal, are the dominant reason that the atmospheric concentration of CO2 has risen by 50%, from 280 parts per million to 420, and it's steadily rising. I'll show that. The Earth's warmed by a little over 1 degree C over the last 160 years. If I change the temperature of this room by 1 degree C while I was talking, the majority of you would not notice it. So when people tell me, oh yeah, it's so much hotter now than when I was a kid, I'm like, that's hard to grasp. That's because you're hearing about it. It is warmer, but that's 1 degree over a century. Increased CO2, absolutely, and as does methane and nitrous oxide, absorbs infrared radiation, makes it harder for the Earth to radiate the heat out to the space, which we need to do to balance the incoming heat to have a flat temperature. Absolutely, it leads to warming of the planet. There's feedback effects that complicate things, but just the atmospheric physics, if you ignore feedback effects, a doubling of CO2 would lead to about 1.3 degrees C warming by itself. The question is that going to lead to more water vapor, which is going to have a positive feedback and triple that warming? That was sort of the original premise 30 or 40 years ago in the climate movement. I would say the data does not support strong positive feedback. The climate sensitivity, the warming we get from a doubling of CO2, looks today to be more in the 1.5 to maybe 2, maybe a little more than 2 degrees C. Most of that, all of that, except the feedback discussion, maybe is not controversial at all. That's just what we know. Here's the measurement of atmospheric CO2 at the Mauna Loa Observatory. So this is the longest running data set we have, 70 plus years of what is the atmospheric CO2. It goes up and down with the seasons, right? Everything grows in the spring and absorbs CO2 and dies in the fall and excels it. But I plot it I always want context. If you plot something to me, give me context. So below 150 parts per million, photosynthesis ceases. That would be a climate crisis, right? If no plants grew, that would be deep, deep trouble. We got to 180 parts per million 25,000 years ago during the Ice Age. So we have been flirting during the time of human existence with relatively low atmospheric CO2 concentrations. But our burning of fossil fuels across the planet has driven this up. And then you can see that line up there. That's a doubling of pre-industrial levels. That's what might lead to maybe somewhere between 1.3 and maybe 2 degrees C of warming when we get to a doubling. And at the current rate or current trajectory, we should get there later this century. Think 50, 60 years from now. The most visible impact of climate change by far is the planet has gotten greener, meaningfully greener. This is a NASA paper with like 22 authors on it. This is satellite data. You only can go back to about 1982 where we have pretty good satellite data. Everything that's green on there means that place on the planet is greener today than it was in 1982. The stuff that's red or brown is less green than it was in 1982. And the stuff that's white is stuff that doesn't have any greenery. So the driest of the deserts and Greenland and Antarctica. So if you want the technical number, the leaf area index had increased a few discrete locations. It's just radiosondes that are looking at the entire lower troposphere of the Earth's atmosphere. We only have the data since 1979, but the planet is warming, absolutely. And if you average it over the entire data set, about 0.13 degrees C per decade. So again, somewhat in line. So by the end, we've warmed by a little more than 1 degree so far in the last, say, 100 years. Maybe we're going to warm by a little more than that in the 21st century, if you extrapolate the current trend. That could rise faster, that could rise slower in the future. But that's the data we have. Sea level, we hear a lot about sea level. Sea levels are rising. The left is tide gauge data. This data actually goes back quite a ways. I show it from the 1880s, I think there. We came out of the Little Ice Age in the middle of the 1800s. Sea level was rising. You can see at the end of that data plot, since post-World War II, with fossil fuels and everything we're doing, sea levels are rising faster now. My personal belief, absolutely, that's human impact. We're warming the planet. When you warm the planet, water expands. That raises sea levels. You melt Antarctica and Greenland. They're smaller sources, but that also puts more water into the ocean. That raises sea levels. So in the 20th century, sea level rose a little less than an inch a decade, maybe 9 inches of sea level rise in the 20th century. We're sort of on track to maybe rise 13, 14, 15 inches in the 21st century. I don't know, again, that's the future, but the last 40 years is a relatively linear rate of warming. So if we rose 9 inches of sea level in the 20th century and we warmed 1 degree C, and it was the greatest century of human progress ever by far, do we think instead of 9 inches of sea level rise, say the upward, say we get 18 inches of sea level rise in the 21st century, and we get 1.5 degrees C of warming instead of 1, do we think our massively wealthier, massively more empowered society is gonna be crushed by something at a smaller magnitude was so enriching? I don't think the 20th century was enriched because of that small warming and that sea level rise. I'm not saying that was a positive. I'm saying that the negative impacts of that weren't even noticed or talked about until modern times. So changes are happening. Those are real. So I used to talk a lot about temperature and feedbacks and all that. The press now is about, and that I think didn't work. We didn't get enough kids scared about 0.13 degrees C warming per decade. So the dialogue switched to extreme weather. Because believe me, and I speak in schools, it is terrifying to kids. Tornadoes, hurricanes, floods, storms, droughts, these are terrifying things. It's not hard to scare people with them. But again, we should look at the data. There's major hurricane data globally, 3-year running average on the left there. That's sort of updated, that's my updated most recently. You can look at 100-year US data, 100-year data. Hurricanes show no trend over the long term, up, down, magnitude, whatever. They have cycles, as you can see in that, and they always have. But hurricanes are scary and nasty and all that, but we don't see any meaningful increase or decrease in hurricanes. Tornadoes are a little bit different. They're one of the extreme weather phenomena that actually have a trend. They've been slowly declining. This is F3 and above, so not the small F1, F2 hurricanes we might get in Colorado, but the big ones, F3 to F5, that are quite damaging. That's data from 1950, again, the entire data set. Drought, I put this in, fires, wildfires on the left. That's what % of the Earth's surface burns every year. We have lower quality data for this going back a century. I'll talk about that in a second. But that's sort of the high quality data. Last 22 years, what have we seen? Actually a pretty meaningful decline, in 30 or 40% decline in the average acres that burn every year globally. That's, again, not opinions, whatever, that's just the data. That's, of course, a wealthier, better off society. Wildfires are dangerous. We're a little bit better at controlling them. The US data is in our Bettering Human Lives report. It used to be very high. We shrunk it dramatically, Smokey the Bear and everything, and we pushed wildfires down by 85%, 90% decline in acres burned. And then we decided in the 70s that we weren't going to manage forests anymore, and we were just going to let them go. Don't touch the national forest lands. We built up more fuel in the undergrowth, and of course the acres burned in the US is rising, but it's still a fraction of what it was in the 20s and 30s before we started to control wildfires. So when you hear stuff on the news, again, just look at the data. This is drought. This is 120 years. This is global % of the planet in severe drought, just a time series over the whole time. If you do it statistically, you look at it or I draw a line in it, it's slightly declining. And drought is slightly declining for a reason. You put more CO2 in the atmosphere, we've warmed the planet a little bit, which means you evaporate more water across all those things, and that water you evaporate falls as rain. So a warmer world is necessarily a wetter world. We're slightly warmer and we're slightly wetter, so drought is slightly declined. But I see all these pictures of parched. Droughts are awful, and they happen, and they've always happened, but they're not on an upward trend. Ending with the human side. So what about the extreme weather scare? What about people dying from extreme weather? Back in the 1920s, 100 years ago, about 500,000 people per year died in extreme weather events. The biggest is floods, hurricanes, and extreme rains. These are very damaging and obviously wipe out villages and kill people. But today, if you look over the last decade, it's like 14,000 people a year. From 500,000 to 14,000 people per year dying. And the global population quadrupled. So if I tell your children that kids 100 years ago had a 50-time higher probability of dying from extreme weather than they do. Probably your risk in the world of dying from extreme weather has never been lower. And it's not because extreme weather events have plummeted. As they showed, most of them basically show no trend. It's just a wealthier, energized, technology-enabled society is much more robust to the things that extreme weather throws at us. So my 3 concluding points. Energy access, security, reliability, and affordability. They're simply urgent for the lives of 8 billion people on Earth. And again, it's not just those people desperately in energy poverty. Think of the lower income people in your own communities, in your own towns. People in Colorado, as we drive electricity prices up, low income people, they feel that. It reduces their quality of life, and it means that blue collar jobs that are energy intensive jobs leave. The United Kingdom, they brag about the largest drop in greenhouse gas emissions, percentage-wise basis of any country. 40% drop in greenhouse gas emissions in the United Kingdom. What they don't brag about is their total energy consumption is dropped by 30%. That's the biggest component of their reduced greenhouse gas emissions. And what it's meant is if you make energy expensive, with harder to access and less reliable, people consume less of it. So all energy-intensive manufacturing just left. The birthplace of the Industrial Revolution doesn't manufacture hardly any energy-intensive things anymore. So instead of being built in the Midlands of England with a natural gas-powered factory, it's made in Vietnam or China in a coal-powered factory and then loaded on a diesel ship and shipped back to England. Like, that's not decarbonization. That's not green. That's exporting jobs and emissions, but not delivering benefits. Climate change is real, but from the data, it's gradual, slow-moving process, and it will only be addressed by ingenuity and technology advancement. It doesn't matter how much money we spend to subsidize wind and solar and batteries. Batteries, they say, that's the fix for wind and solar. I mean, I know they need 10 times as many materials and 100 times as much land, but if we can fix the intermittency, batteries are going to deliver for us. You take all the batteries on the planet today, you can store 1.5 minutes of the global electricity grid. And if everyone hits their crazy aggressive goals by 2030, we'll be able to store 10 minutes of the global electricity grid with batteries. So when a storm hits, it's a week when you're without meaningful resources of wind and solar and all that. And by 2030, we'll be to 10 minutes. Like, we're not going to get to a week with batteries. It's not going to happen. We're going to subsidize a lot. They're going to play grid parts and peak shaving on grids and all that stuff. They're not going to be the energy storage mechanism for large-scale energy. Forcing and it's energy transition in quotes again, because nothing in the data shows we're in an energy transition. But forcing it, calling it that, spending lots of money on it, this threatens human progress. It threatens energy access for people here, and it has an absolutely negligible impact on greenhouse gas emissions. When you close down a plant in Colorado because we're green, we still consume the same materials. It just moves somewhere else and probably uses more polluting or less pollution controls than it would be if it's here. Moving industries around is not green. It's not reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Technology will. Nuclear could play a real role. Beyond the electricity grid, it could provide up to 60% of the process heat, the most important source of energy to make materials. There's next generation geothermal that I think is going to play a role in our electricity grid, but that's slow and a long time to scale. So I'm all for new energy technologies, all for all of us doing a better job at our jobs every day, but we should not put incremental scope 1 reductions in climate change as like our top things we did to make the world a better place. The math just doesn't support that as one of the honorable things you did last year. Thank you so much for sharing time with lunch and being an EnerCom.